Chapter 42. Monica and Rika had taken Pilgrim's body, in a coffin, to La Cour des Miracles in Paris. They were expected and allowed to pass, after being asked to lift the lid on the coffin for the guard, who'd commented, "Elle ne serait pas un problème." "Just tell Monsieur we'll be in my old quarters," Rika had instructed. In his heart, he didn't believe there was anything that could be done, but Monica had said it was going to be all right. He'd taken it on faith, as he did with all things she asked of him. Whatever her plan was, he'd follow it to the letter. At some point, she'd realized the futility of her actions. Rika recalled that night, not so long ago, when Pilgrim had been on the road to recovery. He'd infiltrated Merrillmar House on the pretext of walking Boo to earn some extra money. Initially, he hadn't learnt much, but as soon as Pilgrim had found him that night, they'd had an intense and brief conversation. To begin with, she'd been dangerously hostile, until she discovered who he was, Monica's brother. He'd been prepared to expect something different, given Monica's account of Pilgrim. He'd seen plenty of different while working at the Cour des Miracles, but the shock of witnessing Pilgrim pissed off and beginning to alter had shifted his reality. She'd shared with him the danger she was in and the attempt on her life. She'd told him a second attempt on her life was entirely probable. She understood it was a lot to ask, but if anything were to happen to her, and Baxter was unable to reach her, if they could get to her, they should take her body and place it somewhere safe. She hadn't explained why or what they should do. He'd taken into consideration what he'd witnessed of her, and he'd immediately agreed. After he'd relayed to Monica his conversation with Pilgrim, she'd simply nodded knowingly. Rika's perspective of life had altered. It wasn't the dead that scared him. It was the living that now kept him awake at night. Rika's living space consisted of a subterranean room, branched off from the ancient and redundant sewerage tunnels. The ceilings and floor were of stone, heightening the chilly atmosphere. Lit only by candles, the gentle burble of running water some way off could be heard. They looked at one another doubtfully after lifting Pilgrim's coffin onto a stone platform and arranging a curtain around it. Word of Rika's return with his sister and the dead body of a woman had quickly spread throughout the multifarious members of the Cour des Miracles. Rika and Monica had decided to leave Pilgrim in her coffin. However, Monica had insisted on removing the lid. In death, Pilgrim looked urethral. Her bloodless body still showed the deep splits that ran up her forearms. They'd covered her in a shroud to her neck, hoping to dispel the memory of it. Monica had asked, "What the hell is this place? When you said we'd be somewhere safe, I was thinking of a room, at least, with 4 walls, maybe even a door." All things considered, their current location was the safest bet, she conceded. "So now what?" he asked. Monica had shrugged, remaining silent. "I can tell you, Monica, even in the Cour des Miracles there are standards, and keeping a dead body in your room isn't one of them," he pointed out. Monica understood it was down to her what happened next. "So?" Rika had asked, pushing her for an answer. "I need to think. Let me think," she answered, annoyed. At this point, she hadn't a clue, but she would. Rika had put his hands up in mock submission. "I'm going to ask for a second opinion," he said, leaving. Picking up her MP3, she plugged in her headset, pushed up the volume, closed her eyes, and applied her intellect. To her, it had never been a matter of Pilgrim's body, but the question of how did a terrestrial being reach out across time to her. If anyone knew, they'd be here amongst the fringes of society. By the end of the track, she had known exactly what to do. They'd need the wisdom of a seer. She'd asked if such a person existed amongst those at the Cour de Miracle. She'd pay well. After an interminable wait, someone had come, just as they'd both given up hope. A female had called to them from behind their entrance curtain. Her soft, lyrical voice had soaked their consciousness, willing them to comply. They'd followed, quickly and obediently. They'd been escorted into a quiet stone room. Keeping all doubts to themselves, they'd been instructed to lie side by side. They complied out of fear and had held hands, perhaps for the last time. Rika had smiled over to Monica as her tears had run silently. He'd squeezed her hand, offering an assurance he couldn't be certain he'd be alive to keep. His promise to her remained indelible, even if it took his last breath. The seer had spoken in a measured tone that was underlined by an unearthly force. You must eventually sleep, and when you do, you will dream. You're to practice waking up in your dreams. You understand? Your minds can travel through time and dimensions in a single thought. It is the only way you might reach her. Rika, you must stay by Monica's side. It will strengthen her. Monica, you will search for Pilgrim. It is a big risk, as she might have taken on a different form. She will not be as you once knew her. She might have reverted to her true being. She will be in her element, her territory. Who can say if any of her humanity remains, but it's unlikely she'll show you either pity or remorse. If she comes to you, I don't know what her reaction might be. It had taken days. They'd slept, exhausted, but still nothing had happened. Only the conviction of the seer made them persevere. On occasions, Monica had given in, and Rika would remind her of what she believed. Sometimes Rika had got up and walked away, with Monica begging him to come back. In the end, they'd gone past weight loss, general hygiene, and any thought of themselves. The moment had come simply with little effort, and when sleep was the last state they thought to achieve. Monica had been staring at the rivulets of water running down the inside of the room where they lay, when the brickwork above had become transparent and the sun of a brilliant day had pierced through the gloom. She'd risen through to find herself standing in a vast field of long grass. The landscape was barren, apart from the odd clump of trees in the distance. On the horizon hung two opaque planets, one behind the other. Rika was at her side. She allowed her fingertips to lightly brush along the tops of wild grass as she walked forward. Looking down, she noted she was clean, and her clothes were different. She realized she'd awoken in her dream. "What is this place?" Rika asked, coming to her side. "I'm not sure where we are." She looked about her, puzzled. They stood, silently watchful. Rika asked, confused, "Are you in my dream, or am I in yours?" "I guess there's only one way to find out." She cupped her hands around her mouth and was about to shout when he pulled her hands away. "You need to be sure about this," he said seriously. She looked at him searchingly. She too felt it might be a bad idea, but what was the alternative? to stay hidden for the rest of their lives, dodging their father? I've thought about it. Pilgrim was in our time for a reason. I believe Baxter knew that. I don't have the answer to why, but we have a choice. Baxter trusted her. I think we should too. We're here, so it stands to reason we're meant to be. Rika nodded for her to continue. Cupping her hands to her mouth, she shouted for all she was worth. Pilgrim! Dropping her arms to her sides, she stared out across the land, waiting. Before long, a figure materialized in the distance. It was a woman dressed in long robes. As Pilgrim neared Monica, she put up her hands, splaying her fingers. Monica responded by moving forward to meet her, interlocking her fingers with hers. Rika had remained static and stood warily some feet back. Pilgrim and Monica silently gazed at one another as a breeze flowed through the tops of the grass heads towards them. Upon reaching them, the breeze began to stir their hair and clothes. Monica had become transfixed as Pilgrim accessed her memories leading up to the present moment. The wind had suddenly picked up, quickly intensifying. It seemed to Rika Pilgrim was influencing the elements around her as he was compelled to lean into the wind as it began to gain momentum. As a maelstrom formed around Pilgrim and Monica, he was prevented from moving from his place, crouching down in the grass that was now flattened around him from the backdraft. Staring up with streaming eyes, he saw Pilgrim and Monica stood in what had become the eye of the storm. Within the vortex, their clothes lightly fluttered in slow motion. Rika watched helplessly as Pilgrim's lips parted and her body began to glow, its light enveloping Monica. Screaming, he begged Pilgrim to release her. Everything was still as Monica felt the whispered detachment of her soul from her body. All her terrestrial senses quickly faded away. She was melding with Pilgrim's thoughts. She absorbed the knowledge of Pilgrim's nature as an incalculable energy of every expression. Monica reached Pilgrim's mind. "You're missed," Monica's thoughts swelled. "I'm missed?" Pilgrim questioned. "More than the breath between our lips." Monica felt a warm light swarm through her consciousness in acceptance. Pilgrim released her hands, allowing Monica to fall gently to the ground, alone. When Rika awoke, he found himself laid next to an unconscious Monica. She was held between the physical and spiritual plane. The burn that had immediately entered Monica's body after detaching from Pilgrim had consumed the last of her energy. Over the ensuing hours, Rika cared for her, knowing she hung between life and death. None of it made sense to him, but he talked to her, trying to coax her back, as it was his only remaining option. The following morning, Monica awoke, tired and weakened. The shrouded body of Pilgrim had been removed to a separate chamber. Later that day, a runner of the Corps de Miracle had poked his head around the curtain, instructing Rika he'd better come immediately. Rika cautiously entered Pilgrim's chamber. Lines of candles dispelled the gloom. Lying in her coffin was the warm and restored body of Pilgrim, now sleeping. "C'est un miracle," the runner whispered.